Hi, this is Chris Pearson. I'm president of 5G Americas, and welcome back to our 5G America podcast on understanding 5G. Today, we are so fortunate to have Will Townsend, senior analyst of Moor Insights and Strategy. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, Chris, thanks for having me. Looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, so in our tradition of our 5G Americas podcast, we start out with some kind of openers that are more personal in nature than talking about really our industry much. So I'm going to throw at you three personal questions and see if you want to answer them or not. So the first one is, I am told that you have an executive assistant, your cat, who joins you on some of these webinar calls. First is question then is a tough one. What's your cat's name, and what's the impact of the internet on the cats?
So it's actually my girlfriend's cat. Her name is Iggy, and she does like to join me as my executive assistant. She sits here on the couch right next to me. Sometimes she gets in the frame, sometimes she doesn't, and she's a talker. So she loves, I guess, to hear my voice. And hey, didn't cat videos like kick the internet off, right? So what better an assistant to have than a feline at my side?
All right. Well, if she wants to answer any of our tough questions, just move your camera over to your cat and we'll go from there.
I'll do it.
Second personal question. Where would you most like to live?
That is a great question. I've traveled all around the world, and it's fortunate, given what I do for a living, and I would have to say London. And I never thought, in Europe, I thought, I might enjoy, another country that speaks a different language, but I just always thoroughly enjoy, my visits to London, and maybe because I like craft beer, and London's getting some great new craft beer. It's not that warm, stale stuff that they served for years and years. So I'd have to say London.
Yeah, and then you could take the train over to the Wimbledon Tennis Championships. That'd be great. Next and final personal question. Tell us something about yourself that most in the wireless industry don't know about you.
I love this one. So many years ago, when the TV show Survivor first started, at the time, my partner, she was totally into the show, and just for giggles, I actually applied to the show. I had to do a video, and I actually got a call back, and it's a funny story. Back in the day, unless you were there to take the phone call, they passed you over for the next candidate. And so I wasn't there. She took the phone call. I got home. I learned the news, and unfortunately, I didn't make it on Survivor.
All right. Well, great. All right. Let's get to the understanding 5G portion, a little more technical side. Tell us a little bit about Moor Insights first, so our audience knows a little context here. What's it like working with Patrick Moorhead, Anshel, and basically others on your team who are focused on that wireless sector?
It's a lot of fun. I met Patrick many years ago. We worked at Compact together, and one of the things that's a little bit different about our firm is that we have industry experience. So everyone in the firm has, done a job, in their area of focus and expertise. I started my career at Dell, and my first introduction to cellular was managing the relationship between Dell and Telus and Dell and AT&T when we were trying, to get activations against mobile broadband modems that we were integrating into the Latitude notebooks. And so that's how I met Patrick. Years later, it's been about 5 years since I've been with the firm. He picked up the phone, said, hey, I hear good things about you. This is, the analyst gig is a lot of fun, and come join us. And what I also love about his attitude is that he doesn't build a lot of bureaucracy, into the company structure. So he really allows us to manage our own areas of focus. And Chris, as you know, I manage the networking practice for the firm. I cover enterprise networking and obviously service provider, consult with some of the largest operators in the world, as well as infrastructure providers as well. So it's a lot of fun. It's also fun working with Anshel. He's my 5G partner in crime. As I think we have a weekly 5G podcast. And what's nice about our attacking that together is that he covers end devices, and he's also our AR and VR expert. And obviously there are a lot of 5G tie-ins to AR and VR. And so I cover infrastructure. And so, we do about a 20-minute hot take on the latest news of the week, and it's super fun working with him. He's also quite young. I'm gonna say he's in his early 30s, and I'm quite a bit older than he is. And so it's fun, working with someone that young, and he's extremely intelligent and bright. And that's the other thing I love about my firm is that we have so many bright, smart people at the firm. It just makes it a joy to come to work every day.
Great. So these questions are going to be easy peasy for you then without effort. So, although I haven't heard the name Compact in quite some time. So let's see here. What are some of the biggest issues facing the wireless telecom companies today when they start to think about how they're going to work with enterprises and when they bring their 5G as they bring their 5G to the marketplace?
Yeah, the challenge really is route to market from my perspective, because I worked in corporate America for 30 years. Like I mentioned, I started my career at Dell, and I worked at Compaq and eventually Hewlett Packard after the acquisition of Compaq. And really, from my perspective, it's understanding that go to market. And so when you start talking about opportunities like with private cellular networking and that sort of thing, it's really sort of figuring that out. Obviously traditionally within the enterprise, it's been wired, it's been Ethernet, it's been Wi-Fi. Those technologies have been somewhat straightforward to manage, especially with Wi-Fi, because it's licensed. It's unlicensed spectrum relative to the licensed spectrum nature of cellular. So really, from my perspective, the big challenge is route to market for service providers and mobile network operators.
And well, how do you feel like if you look at the market, 5G is doing compared to the previous generations, and what it's bringing to the table maybe compared to previous generations? What's your viewpoint on that?
Yeah, well, and I think most would probably, agree with my assessment. I mean, when you look at where we're at in 5G deployments relative to the other Gs, I mean, we are certainly much further ahead just from a timeline perspective. And I think there are two reasons for that. Number one, 5G inherently is more virtualized. It's more software defined than any previous G. And so, there's lots of talk about things like Open RAN, that's going to leverage a lot of virtualization and software-defined networking. And you're seeing the effects of software-defined networking even in the enterprise as well. It's just bringing new levels of agility. Cloud-native architectures as well are bringing scale and agility. And so, that's sort of one thing that I point to.
Okay. Yeah. Well, let's talk a little deeper about that. So,
Yeah.
Talk about the significance of cloud computing as it relates to 5G networks, and what would be some of the benefits of cloudification, as well as what are maybe some of the challenges and the opportunities?
So, so from my perspective, cloud brings scale, and it brings
Yeah.
efficient scale. And, there are obvious, CapEx and OpEx advantages of leaning into cloudification. When you see what's happening with the hyperscalers, in particular AWS and Azure, and what they are doing to enable edge computing, is really significant, and they're able to do that very cost effectively. And so what about edge? Well, when folks ask me like, okay, what's the impact of edge on 5G? I like to kind of use the analogy that it's a supercharge effect. So when you bring computing resources closer to the data creation points on a network, whether that's near edge, far edge, fog, there are lots of definitions for that. You reduce latency, you supercharge certain applications, and you only have to point to recent announcements between operators in the United States. For example, a lot of the announcements you're seeing between Vodafone and AWS, and you're seeing some other announcements from the AT&Ts of the world as well that are embracing the cloud. So it's really going to bring agility. It's going to bring scale. I mean, certainly COVID proved that out. We all, in a lurch, had to work from home. There was definitely stress on those networks as a lot of people leaned into cellular when maybe, broadband in the home was being, occupied by other users, like, kids that were doing distance learning, or, telemedicine sessions for COVID, that sort of thing. So, it's just at the end of the day, it's really going to bring that needed scale and that agility.
Yeah. And you mentioned, agreements, or one agreement that recently made, and I think that's significant as we see this momentum of cloudification and so forth. But there are some questions I have about that. So, the cloud providers, based on just like the announcement you mentioned, or some of the that you mentioned, they have a more visible role in what's going on in this 5G ecosystem, really for the first time, right? So 5G is deployed, you're seeing agreements. So where is this demarcation point, or demarcation line between, a cloud provider, a wireless network operator, and where does it happen? Is it in the RAN? Is it in the core, the backhaul, the transport, the virtualization, all of it? Where in Will Townsend's viewpoint is this demarcation line?
I think the biggest impact potentially is in the RAN. When you look at what's going on with all the momentum behind Open RAN, and a lot of that is being driven by the U.S. government's desire to have a more domesticated supply chain to support 5G, even beyond. I mean, not even talking about China, but in Ericsson and Nokia, I mean, they're European companies, and so they don't necessarily pose a threat to our national security, but it's just the desire to sort of wean our interdependence off of that. And I really, and obviously the other thing that's happening with the public cloud providers is that addressable market for them is shrinking. So they have to look at other revenue opportunities, and certainly telco cloud is one of them. And from my perspective, AWS and Azure have done the best job. AWS really, in my mind, is in the pole position with Wavelength and Outpost and what they're doing to drive, edge, MEC and edge compute and that sort of thing. Azure has made several key acquisitions that have kind of brought their capabilities up to speed. Google still lacking somewhat behind, but in Anthos, they have a platform that could be very viable. But the challenge is, with a Google, they were actually holding spectrum, and so there were a lot of questions for a while. Does Google plan to get into the into the MNO space?
Right.
And from my perspective, that's not a core competency of a hyperscaler.
Right.
You're seeing these partnerships and these lockups between AWS and Azure, with not only operators in the U.S., which I know is the 5G Americas focus, but also in other parts of the world as well. So I really think at the end of the day that the demarcation is going to settle out. I don't believe the public cloud providers are going to get into the MNO space. I mean, that's a high barrier of entry. There's a certain knowledge and acumen that you have to go execute and do that sort of thing. And so I think it's going to be this. We're going to continue to see these partnerships between the hyperscalers and the operators, because it's just going to improve the overall quality of service, not only for consumers, but for businesses, which is where I really think the biggest impact for 5G will be made.
Yeah, and we've seen these announcements, actually throughout the Americas, and we do focus on North and Central and South America, but we've seen these types of announcements by companies throughout the Americas region. So you had mentioned actually earlier in your comments about edge computing.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to get, maybe your opinion for our listeners about what's the importance of edge computing, because people start to look at this new network architecture, the cloudification, all the different new elements that are coming into kind of the overall strategy of operators. Where does edge computing fit in?
Well, yeah. So, I kind of spoke a little bit to kind of the analogy on how it's going to supercharge things. I mean, edge is going to play a vital role, especially when you look at some of what I call the poster child use cases for 5G,
right.
Such as autonomous driving. And it's an incredible statistic, but the prediction is, on average, the connected car is going to generate a terabyte of data daily, right?
Yeah.
And so you're not going to be able to process that. You're not going to be able to send or even sift that and send that to the cloud and back, and be able to have accurate road telemetry to keep autonomous vehicles safe. We're in the early stages. I mean, Tesla gets a lot of knocks, but Also, a lot of their owners do stupid things like, try to put their cars on autonomy and take a nap and that sort of thing. But
Right.
but with that use case, and that's probably one of the most valued around use cases, you're going to have a combination of 5G with its low latency and its high throughput and edge to be able to process all of that data at one time to make that use case a reality. And it's sort of, I like to lean back into like, okay, what was the killer, use case that came out of 4G? And I think most people would agree that it was ride sharing, because with 4G, you finally got that consistency of throughput. And
Hmm.
then with the triangulation of GPS and the app connectivity, it kind of brought that all together. And with autonomous driving, you're going to absolutely have to have edge, because the amount of data that's going to be produced is going to be unbelievable.
Right. When would you see that progress getting to the point where you see edge computing ubiquitous at all the cell sites? I mean, when do you see that? I mean, it's probably regional, of course, but what's your
Yeah.
feeling in general when we might see more ubiquity of edge at the cell sites?
I think you're already beginning to see it, because in certain solution providers like HPE, they have a very mature telco business unit. In fact, I just spent time with two of their executives this morning, and they've got some great form factors within the HPE product line that are very small, that are very low power, that are easily deployed onto a cell tower.
Right.
And so you're already beginning to see that now. And the other thing you're going to begin to see too, and it's not necessarily edge, but it's densification. And this very well, especially for millimeter wave, great performance, but very short propagation. And so you need densification to sort of magnify those signals. And so I think you're going to see a trend towards more edge, deployment in these smaller form factors at cell towers. But you're also going to see a proliferation of densification of small cells, and not only on, near traditional towers, but on, strand mounted, on, traffic signals and light posts and those sort of things. So there are some challenges, with many municipalities, especially in my home of Austin, Texas, where
Hmm.
there's concerns about, hey, if you densify, it's sort of that whole, conspiracy theory about, is 5G going to cook our brains? And Anshul and I did a pretty funny podcast on our inaugural podcast. We wore tinfoil hats and said no. We sort of myth busted, the 5G things.
Okay.
But it's a logical concern. If you put more radios, in proximity, that is going to cause that. But
Yeah.
I probably got a little long-winded in that answer. But I think you will see a trend towards, more edge deployment because of the form factors. And then, you're going to see a lot of, these small cell devices deployed. Qualcomm has been pretty instrumental in helping develop an entire ecosystem there, and you're seeing companies like Airspan and others that are really growing, sort of as a result of this opportunity. But a long way to answer your question, Chris. But I think we'll see lots of momentum in the next 18 to 24 months for sure.
Yeah. You mentioned autonomous driving a bit in a few of your answers today. And
Yeah.
obviously, one of the applications or use cases that I know, if I have autonomous driving on, I want low latency and ultra reliable low latency and communications, right?
Yeah.
So, what would be some areas that, besides that use case, that you think is going to be really important to have that ultra reliable and low latency communications as part of the solution? What other use cases are you and your firm seeing are going to need that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, number one, public safety in smart city. And, smart city is a pretty broad term,
Yeah.
but when I think of the importance of ultra low latency, I think of video and high resolution video, and I think of, just, monitoring, areas and grids within a city. There's a
Right.
lot of work that's been done outside of the U.S. to do that very thing, to improve the safety of the citizenry as well, right? And I think the FirstNet network that AT&T has built out, although it's primarily voice now, I think that's going to move, very quickly into video. And another use case that I'm seeing, and I've sort of coined a term, I call it extended SME. And it's the whole notion of using these new form factors that are foldable that we're seeing from companies like Samsung and Motorola, and putting them in the hands of field service technicians, and then using a very fast, low latency connection via 5G to that smart device to allow these people to do field service and be able to communicate with a call center with maybe a more highly trained tech back at the call center,
Right.
to help diagnose issues and remediate issues and that sort of thing. And the benefit to that is that you can put more people in the field. You can employ more people. They're not as costly because they're not as highly trained. And
Right.
and then that's a job creator as well. And there are lots of applications for that.
Yeah.
Not only telecommunications, but oil and gas. Fleet. Management. You name it. So it's sort of a general category, but I think that extended SME use case will end up touching multiple industries and verticals, and really 5G is going to enable all of that.
Right. All right. Well, we're coming toward the end of our Understanding 5G podcast. So I want to end it though with a question about you've had a vast experience. Your firm has vast experience. Looking as we go through generational technologies. We're in 5G. What in the next few years should the 5G industry be focusing on and really trying to either address or just work on? What would be your advice to the 5G wireless industry?
Would it be addressed towards the Americas or just globally?
Your choice, Americas or globally. What would be your advice to the 5G wireless ecosystem?
Yeah, so my advice, like if we put an America's lens on it, it would be getting back to that supply chain notion. And I come from 30 years of business experience, and in business, you always want continuity of supply. And Ericsson and Nokia have been great partners in US rollouts, certainly. But I do think what's exciting about Open RAN, although we're in the very nascent stages of Open RAN and standards are still coalescing, and you have different consortia and that sort of thing that are trying to drive standardization and that sort of thing, that should get all settled out. I don't think the impact of Open RAN will be dramatic on 5G because so many operators are already amidst the deployment. But when I start thinking about 5.5G and 6G and beyond, what's exciting for me is that we can finally start developing a more America's supply chain so that we don't have to be dependent, on other countries. And also, what's exciting about 5G is that because it's so software defined, if you think about where the US really excels, it's in software development. And so I do believe 5G is going to bring the promise of new jobs and new opportunities, not only in the overall deployment of these networks, but in all of the amazing applications and killer use cases that are going to result from 5G. So like if ride sharing was a kind of a watershed, which it was with 4G, I can't wait to see what's in store for 5G.
Yeah, what a great way to close it. Again, I just want to say, Will, on behalf of 5G Americas, thanks for joining us today on our podcast series. And stay safe, stay healthy, and thanks again.
Thanks, Chris.